Today we celebrate Law Day all over America, and I know many of you heard about May 1st. It's Law Day, it's May Day, and you're wondering what is it that we should celebrate when we look at the police involved shootings that have occurred in major cities all across the country. It seems like in the midst of the George Floyd trial, there have been an increased number of shootings in Minneapolis, well, in the suburb of Minneapolis, in Ohio, in North Carolina. And so we're going to have a panel of lawyers discuss with you and I today about what they see in terms of some of the legal issues regarding police use of force, and what are some of the recommendations for change. The other thing we want to talk about, and you could say you've heard it here first, we're going to talk about treaty rights, and we're going to talk about air property as a part of this legal panel. Welcome to Legal Roundtable. It's Law Day in America. All over the country, we are looking at the progress we've made in terms of public policy, but also looking at the challenges we face within our legal community. It's police reform, voting rights, housing issues, Native American rights and issues. And so I have a panel of legal experts who will share a discussion on many of the issues and give us a sense of the direction we should take to achieve positive outcomes. I'm going to start with the former president of the National Bar Association, and who is now the vice chair of the American Bar Association Social Justice Committee, Attorney Juan Thomas. You've been dealing with police reform issues for some time, as well as a number of other issues. What do you say about the climate we live in, and what are the recommendations you have for lawyers and community residents?
Thank you, Reverend Wilson, for having us, and thank you to Reverend Jackson in his absence for his continued leadership on a variety of issues. He's truly been a champion for all of us for over 50 years, and we continue to lift him up in prayer concerning his health challenges, but also so glad to see him still on the battlefield. And literally last week, we saw him and Reverend Sharpton and Attorney Ben Crump and others in Minneapolis, Minnesota, awaiting the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. And luckily and happily, that jury verdict came back guilty on all charges. And while we took a moment to celebrate the accountability of that verdict, I think we've all come to realize that that is not ultimately justice for all. True justice would mean that these killings would stop. But we saw just that same day, that same week, other African Americans, people of color, are still being killed by the police. DeMarcus Wright, and now we see in North Carolina, Andrew Brown Jr. And this kind of underscores the reality that systemic and institutional racism have been defining elements of policing in our country by design and by practice. We cannot separate policing from the roots of systemic racism and institutional racism in this country. The origins of our policing come from targeting people of color after slavery was outlawed. And we are still seeing the impact of this design today. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court in particular has expanded the powers of over-policing, particularly police powers around qualified immunity, over the last 50 years. Specifically, stop and frisk and pretextual traffic stops have allowed police officers to over-police communities of color. And the Supreme Court has empowered police departments across the country with these tools that have terrorized communities of color. This has had a tremendous impact on the Black and the brown community. Unfortunately, armed officers in this country are called regarding traffic violations, mental illness issues, substance abuse, poverty, school discipline, and a host of other social issues that they are not trained and equipped to handle. But when one of these issues arise, as we saw in Columbus, Ohio, we saw a police officer pull up to a family home and shoot someone who, yes, was about to stab someone else, but they were having a family dispute. And the question becomes, while there's a debate right now if that was justified or not, did someone have to lose their life over an internal family dispute such as that? Policing is not always the solution for our mental health challenges or domestic violence challenges that face so many people in our communities. We are criminalizing social, health, and economic problems, and we put police on the front lines to solve these problems when they're not equipped to do so, and too many people are losing their lives because of it. Police violence also contributes to multi-generational trauma. The families of Breonna Taylor, the families of Tamir Rice, the families of George Floyd, the family members who are in the family of Ahmaud Arbery and Eric Gardner and so many others, and now Andrew Brown again, DeMarcus Wright again in Ohio, those families will have trauma and mental health and depression issues for generations in their families. And we've yet to talk about those issues on a personal level with those families, but the mental health this has on so many of us, and how I will say, even though I don't know every Black person in America, the ones I do know are exhausted by these continued challenges and this violence.
Now that we understand the challenges, what are your recommendations? 1, 2, 3. 3 recommendations you have as a solution.
Well, several, but one, on a local level, local community leaders have to engage in community partners and partnering with local police departments to change practices and building trust in the community. Local and state leaders have to be willing to challenge police unions, particularly around their union contracts that often are written to protect local police officers. On a national level, I believe we need to pass the George Floyd Act that calls for dismantling qualified immunity. And we also have to change laws that continue to allow police officers to over-police communities. And so police reform means legal reform. We have to change the law on the local, state, and national level. And we need to elect people to public office who have the courage to stand up to these police unions and these law enforcement officers and not be afraid of being labeled supporting criminals, or you're against, or you support crime, and you don't believe in safe neighborhoods. Those terms are used to confuse and manipulate, and often is used to undermine credible candidates that are really trying to just bring what Dr. King would call a beloved community.
Attorney Thomas has laid out in great detail the concerns, the issues that are involved. How can local governments address policing, especially the use of excessive force by police officers? We have a term that police engage in shoot to kill. Mm-hmm. They are trained to eliminate the threat, whatever, whether it's perceived or actual. Their goal is to eliminate the threat, not to de-escalate. That's how most of them are trained, shoot, body, mass. So how can local governments address this issue of force?
I'm going to take us back in time a little bit to 2001 in Cincinnati, Ohio, when there was the shooting of Timothy Thomas, which sparked days of civil unrest / riots in Cincinnati. And at that time, Cincinnati embarked upon a landmark collaborative agreement. That was an agreement between the police department, the administration for the city of Cincinnati, and the community. And I bring that up because I think it highlights that there need to be three components to this conversation when you talk about local government response. There's got to be a community partnership, as Juan referred to. There's got to be police reviewing and taking a look at their practices and the way that they execute when they are confronted with these situations. And then the administration has to take their own responsibility and not defer to the police department. And so as a result, it becomes a partnership on how to respond and how to address. At the end of the day, there is a huge training issue. As you mentioned, Reverend, there seems to, they lost the pendulum. There used to be this use of force pendulum, and you could go from one end to the other. Obviously, if you were confronted with deadly force, you're allowed to use deadly force in response, but you were supposed to look at the use of force pendulum, and it's supposed to be in your head in terms of, I don't have to move all the way to a weapon. I could use my taser, or I could use my training. Many people talk about the situation that occurred in Columbus with a 16-year-old teenager. And the reality is she was a 16-year-old girl. And so shouldn't there have been some training with that police officer that he was going to be able to de-escalate, or in the alternative, take control of the situation without having to shoot her 4 times? And so I think we have a real need to revisit training, and that the police officers need to take a look at that. But I also think they need to begin to do some training on de-escalation. And then lastly, one point that Juan also referenced is we created what was called a mental health response team. And a number of police departments have something very similar. But obviously, as budgets adjust and times change, those kind of things go by the wayside. But many times we are talking about people who are in crises, mental crises, and it is not a situation of violence, but rather is a situation that perhaps someone who had mental health training could de-escalate and resolve the situation. So for me, I think local government needs to revisit the way that they're doing business, and then perhaps put some of the money that is invested in police and put it back into training our police officers using that use of force pendulum, but also bringing in community leaders so that it's a partnership, of education and understanding, but also working together. And then lastly, I'll just simply say, while I was city attorney in Cincinnati, it was one day that stayed with me was there was a shooting of an African-American male at a White Castle. And it was clear he was combative. They brought out MHRT. But the thing that I'd like to note is by the time the media got a hold of it, the police was on the scene, the community was on the scene, and the administration was on the scene, and everybody was on one page. And imagine that. There was information, there were facts, there was a combined response, and we were able to deal with it as a community rather than to blow up and escalate the situation.
I am with the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Leadership Council, and I'm also a part of the ABA's state and local governments voting rights team. And I would like to really speak to the role that supporting and defending the right to vote and what impact that has on policing and police accountability. I believe that if we look at the amount of litigation and the efforts that have had to be put into place in an effort to ensure that every vote is counted and to defend against voter suppression, I think those issues need to be put front and center as we start talking about policing. Because we all know that if you don't have the power of the vote, if you don't have the power of your voice, then we're not going to be able to actually effectuate any type of change in terms of policing, in terms of protocol, policy, practice of the police departments as they move forward. And so as I look at the litigation efforts and the overview that most litigators themselves have had, the resolutions that are being passed within the ABA in support of voting rights and election protection against voter suppression, and in support of policing, in support of defending and rearranging and reassigning how policing will be done in our communities, I believe that it's important to go right back to how we as ABA, how Rainbow Push and others can work together to ensure that the power and the efficacy of the vote goes into the actual legislative process in terms of policing.
Delegate Kim Teehee, there are safety issues in Indian country. There are a number of other issues. And so I thought it would be helpful if you share some of the similarities and differences between the legal concerns that Native Americans have as compared to African Americans and other people of color.
Thank you, Reverend Wilson.
Good morning.
Thank you for having me here today. Chief Hoskins sends his regrets that he wasn't able to join today, so please give Reverend Jackson our best. What I want to talk about is, issues that are not completely dissimilar from what we just heard. Just recently, the United States Supreme Court rendered a ruling in a court case called, we just call it McGirt. And it basically ruled that Congress did not disestablish the reservation of the Muskogee Creek Nation. That ruling was based upon an interpretation of provisions that are similar to treaties of Cherokee Nation. And so as a result of that, there is ongoing efforts within Oklahoma on the tribes that are impacted by this decision. There are 5 main tribes that are impacted by this decision. And what that means is that the state no longer has criminal jurisdiction over Indians who commit crime on reservation boundaries. And up until the McGirt case, it was thought that Indian tribes themselves had limited areas on which they could assert criminal jurisdiction. So as a result of this case, at least 5 tribes have had to staff up, have had to, we at Cherokee Nation, we've hired more law enforcement officers. We have enhanced our criminal justice system by appointing more justices. And we have had to expand our partnerships with the 14 counties that we occupy and come to some compacting arrangements as well. We have a state system within our reservation where cases of criminals are being released and where the tribe is having to refile or the federal government is having to refile. Just today, our Attorney General told us that we have refiled 646 cases stemming from releases from the state system of Indian criminals. And then the federal government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, is having to refile these cases too. We're having to staff up. Just to give you a sense of scale, in a given year, we might not see 200 cases. So we've already way surpassed that. What this means for us is, this was an historic case. Justice Gorsuch said at the beginning, he talked about at the end of the trail, meaning the end of the Trail of Tears, the forced removal, was a promise. The promise of the federal government to assure the boundaries of the reservations of these tribes were intact, and that Congress had never disestablished those reservations. But we also recognize too that despite the historic great ruling that this case was, that the tribes don't have the resources to do all that's necessary to accommodate this ruling. So we're cobbling together our funding, investing millions into the system, and we need help from the federal government, more directed resources so that we can build up our justice systems even better, so that criminals don't go free. And I know Congress is looking at this as well. And so we don't want the good that this court ruling did in acknowledging that our reservations were never disestablished to be for it to be clouded by the fact that we have criminals being released because we are concurrently working in that environment where we're trying to prosecute, and we file those cases in tribal court. And so we're doing that. But what this tells us too, and what I don't want to lose sight of, because it goes to the heart of what I also want to talk about, which is treaties matter. In this U.S. Supreme Court reviewed the treaties between the tribe and the United States. Treaties matter. And when Congress does not directly, expressly abrogate, or courts do not abrogate treaty rights, they are still the supreme law of the land. So what Cherokee Nation, and Reverend Wilson, this, is trying to do is to get the United States House of Representatives to honor a treaty right of the Cherokee Nation from 1835. That treaty right is the very treaty that is our removal treaty. That treaty was signed by an illegal faction that led to the forced removal of Cherokees from the east to the west, to today, Oklahoma, where a quarter of our population died. So when I think of Mr. Thomas talking about historic trauma, absolutely there's historic trauma. We all carry it in us, the indignities and the unfortunate history that's there. But what a measure of justice, what a small measure of justice it would be for the United States to honor the treaty right of the Cherokee Nation and seat a delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives. And that's a treaty right that we're trying to get seated this Congress. Our hope is that we can get it done. We have a path to get it done. And I know my time is limited here, but I wanted to raise those two very important points for us.
We have so much more in common than we have apart. And when you start looking at the similarities in our struggle, and when Attorney Thomas talks about historic trauma, well, it didn't just start with Africans who were brought here into the Americas. Think about the Native Americans who are already here and the historic trauma that they've experienced, the violence from what we remember as slave catchers.
My family was blessed by getting out of Eastern Europe before the Nazis came to power. But certainly the Holocaust was a very poignant experience in my growing up. And I am concerned as a historian by the rise of nationalism in this country, and it worries me a great deal. That's all by way of background. I would also say to the delegate that it was very interesting on a teaching gig in New Zealand a number of years ago to find that the Maori had won a lawsuit about their land rights on the basis of research that was done on the American treaties. And so the treaties are extremely important. Now, in my brief time left, I'm getting to know the Reverend Wilson particularly well because of our joint interest in heirs property and in making land available to generations of African Americans, of Native Americans, of Hispanic Americans, of Pacific Island Americans in Hawaii, and of poor whites, and of people who actually are majority, but who find themselves without rights to their property because a family member died before writing a will. And Thomas Mitchell and I have been in the process of co-editing a book on heirs property law and on the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, which has now been adopted in 17 jurisdictions and is up for consideration in 4 more. I feel as if I work with a rock star. Thomas wrote the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act 17 years ago. He was actually closer to 20 now. He was told that as an African-American lawyer, it was probably a career stopper. Someone in a white shoe law firm said, you shouldn't do this. You should think about something else. It has become his crusade. He has now become a MacArthur Fellow. He is most excited that he received the Howard University Alumni Award of the Year, which for this work, which puts him in the same shoes as Thurgood Marshall, as the Vice President of the United States, and as Snoopy. And he thinks that particularly being compared to a rapper is wonderful. We are trying to make it possible for people who live in urban areas and who are preyed on by developers who come in and say, well, we'll just snarf up your real estate at a very cheap rate because you co-own it with other people. and you don't have the rights that you would have if you had inherited it and had clear title, not to be subject to predators. And under the Uniform Act, it is now mandatory to have a cooling off period before these sales can take place. My recommendation would be to work very hard, not only to get the law passed if you live in a jurisdiction where it doesn't yet exist, but to know that there are rights in the place where you live and to remind lawyers and others that they exist and to act on them. Thank you very much, Reverend.
Thank you. Thank all of you, each one of you, for spending this time. I think that we have to get into each one of the areas, obviously more specifically and more deeply. I mean, the whole issue of air property, that's a seminar all by itself, because many of us are unaware of property that our relatives had. We don't know how to protect it. We don't know the laws of the various states. And African Americans have lost a great deal of land with this whole issue of air property. The police reform issue is a hot topic for many jurisdictions today, with the police involved, use of excessive force. And so I think that we should convene a meeting with municipalities to look at this issue and how they can address it. How do they negotiate these police contracts, which are the same across the board? And so just as they've been skillful in putting terms in those contracts, we have to be skillful in removing certain language and issues and training small jurisdiction mayors and city managers as to what to do. And then the Native American issues are issues that are really specific to the founding of this country. How we honor or disregard treaties matters, not just with Native Americans, but as we know, how we are viewed in the world court. And so Delegate Teehee, I'm so glad that you're always available to share with us. And we need to spend more time understanding what it means when you say Indian country and what it means to have a treaty. Most of us, even in law school, we didn't spend much time on treaties at all. You know, we knew they existed, but I don't know, there's never been a course on treaties.
Well, Reverend Wilson, whenever you are ready, I'm happy to have an Indians 101 session, just talking about air property. Not many people realize that Congress passed laws unique to the 5 tribes I just talked about earlier regarding how individual Indians inherit their Indian land allotments. And I was able, luckily, to take the lead in getting Congress to change it. But did you know that if an Indian land allotment heir fell below half blood quantum of that Indian blood, that land, by operation of law, fell into fee? That has been the biggest hemorrhage of loss of Indian land in modern history.
We need to talk about that with the air property discussion. This is information that everybody needs. Doesn't matter your area of practice. This is just like general kind of knowledge, I think. Don't y'all agree?
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
Okay. Am I talking to myself? Preachers, we have to have call and response in the African American tradition. I say X, you say Y. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.